Now the next the next and final one of these series of remarks is called "Do We Terminate?" Now, lest you fear that might suggest that I will not terminate, that would not be the last one, let me assure you that is not the case. The general subject of these remarks today is to take us from the place where we were last time, which was essentially about problems in listening, to draw us forward to the issues of what we do with what we hear. Now, we've gotten there circuitously, perhaps, but as you recall, starting from a psychological position, that is a concern with perspective, not starting, as many people have, from a biological position with a concern, say, with zones and biologically developmental phases, but from the essential nature of psychological life, that is to take perspective. And I dealt at length with what I thought might be useful in terms of dealing with perspectives, that is the need of tact and timing and an awareness of feelings in the inevitable collision of perspectives which two people's meeting, perhaps especially in psychotherapy, two people's meeting produces. I think I could turn that off. That the two people's meeting produces. Now, as our concern with perspective deepens, so does our awareness of the limits of perspective as an endpoint to psychological concerns, and that draws us toward this oxymoron term, psychological reality, which means to suggest that there is always something outside perspective, beyond any one perspective, perhaps beyond all perspectives, which we call reality. And this claim is made not only for the perspectives on the external world, the physical world, where it is a classic philosophical position, of course, but also in terms of the internal world. And it arises for us as an urgent concern when we find our own perspective and even the mixture of perspectives inadequate to realize an existence that seems to us acceptable. Hence the therapeutic interest in reality, that individual reality, that it allow us to subscribe, or at least approach a subscription to a lifetime that we can find livable. Now, in going from perspective to a search for psychological reality, we have to find our way. And last time, you remember, I dealt with essentially the reception of nothingness. That is, by nothingness I mean our not knowing, the patient's not knowing, our not comprehending, our capacity often to formulate but only to penetrate to possibilities without the confidence of anything like a fact. And so we listen. And I suggested a model provided for us by Count Cézanne gave of his work, in which the motif, that is in our case the patient, works upon the emotional apprehension of the artist or the therapist, and the artistic or the psychological conscience of the receiver attempts to receive pristinely as possible these people, this person before us, not to distort them in the form of cliches or conventions or preconceptions. An impossible task, fundamentally, but one which we strive for. Now, as we listen, as the person perhaps manifests themselves in a form that impacts on our emotional apprehension, we, of course, have ideas. Some of them seem to us authentic ideas, and as to what the nature of this person is, often loving ideas. And here I wanted to quote for you an extraordinary paragraph from Friedrich Nietzsche, in which, in his very special way, he speaks about a process which I think will remind you, as it did me, of what we're talking about. Nietzsche writes, "One must learn to love. This is our experience in music. We must first learn in general to hear fully, and to distinguish a theme or a melody. We have to isolate and limit it as a life by itself. Then we need to exercise effort and goodwill in order to endure it, in spite of its strangeness. Then we need patience toward its strangeness, and toward its aspects and other expressions, and indulgence towards what is odd in it. And in the end, there comes a moment when we are accustomed to it, when we expect it, when it dawns upon us that we should miss it if it were lacking. And then it goes on to exercise its spell and charm more and more, and does not cease until we have become its humble and enraptured lovers, who want it again and again, and ask for nothing better from the world. It is thus with us, not only in music. It is precisely thus that we have learned to love everything that we love. We are always recompensed finally for our goodwill, our patience, our reasonableness and gentleness toward what is unfamiliar, by the unfamiliar slowly throwing off its veil and presenting itself to us as a new, ineffable beauty. That is its thanks for our hospitality." Well, I don't need to dwell on the different aspects of that process, which probably remind you of experiences that we've all had in our own dwelling on strangeness and coming into a appreciation, even an enrapturement, which is, as he says, the thanks we get for our hospitality. But these are strange remarks to hear from Nietzsche, aren't they? That tortured soul. And they're strange remarks for us to hear, not only from Nietzsche, but because there is something missing in this account, isn't there? There is something missing in this account which is central to everything we do, it seems to me, which sentimentalizes the difficulty of our work and omits, at least it omits, what Freud called the repetition compulsion. That is the extraordinary stubbornness that stands between us and this hospitality, beauty, reception, etc. And it is true, I think, that all of us could recount even many cases, instances, relationships in treatment as well as outside, of course, in which this process did unfold with surprising ease. But that is certainly the exception. And that people come to us precisely because this does not happen for them. And that we propose to make it happen in the course of our work, however quickly or slowly or efficiently or inefficiently. So that this presents to us an ironical twist, because it reminds us of what we might like to do, but it reminds us even more definitively of what we cannot often do. And so we can certainly speak of the obstructions that repetitive behaviors put between the patient and their future. And that brings us to what I want to both illustrate with case material today, but also summarize in the form of certain things I think I've learned about overcoming these obstructions. So if we mean to do this, how do we do it? despite these obstructions. What do we do? Now, I'm going to suggest to you, and I'm going to enlarge on this and even make a bold or brave attempt next time in my discussion of termination to draw up a little research program of how we might test even more, although what I'm going to say has been tested in part, the methods that I'm suggesting for the getting past these obstructions. I want to say first that I think our work has been hobbled, handicapped by the almost steady neglect of the problem of power. Now, I've alluded to it in these remarks, but let me dwell on it a bit more. Power is psychologically largely immeasurable, and it falls under what Freud called the economic factor, which he opposed to the topographic and the other series of dimensions that he attempted to describe. But it remains, for all its immeasurability, it remains a central concern. Now, I first talked about this explicitly in terms of what I call the balance of power, the importance in relationships of having a balance of power, not only in a relationship like marriage, where it's particularly central, but in psychotherapy too, where unless there is some balance of power, we will either override the patient or the patient will override us, which I think the second case being often what is called the borderline syndromes. Some balance of power. I would argue, although this is certainly only a contention, that the balance of power is necessary because of the way we are constituted. That is, we are reptilian creatures in part, and the reptilian brain remains in the very center of our archipelagium, and represents itself in politics and personal life by the famous British saying that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts. Absolutely, that is that we are in the presence of powerlessness of any form. For whatever reason, it is very hard for us to maintain an attitude of neutrality, equality, respect even. And so that many clinical difficulties arise in my experience because for one reason or another we are overpowered or perhaps sometimes not acknowledging the importance of our or the patient's power. So I have two laws that are pretentiously named laws that I have drawn out of my experience. One is this importance of the balance of power, but the second I call the second law, which moves us more toward the therapeutic encounter itself. And the second law goes in a form that will be familiar to you. Every personality continues in the same direction and with the same momentum until acted upon by another personality in equal and opposite direction. That is, that this is my way of saying that the movement of a personality is not deflected by insights or goodwill or hopes even, but to the most significant extent by the countervailing force of another personality. Now, the way in which this keeps from being a tyranny is that it is a balance of power. So we can speak of psychotherapy, in my experience at its best, psychotherapy at its best, as being essentially a leaning into each other of two people. Now, I'm going to develop that more shortly, but let me finish this sort of summary of what I'm going to say by mentioning some other factors important, it seems to me, in this work. Not only is power central, and the imposition of power upon each other inevitable and desirable, but the way in which we apply ourselves to each other, the form we give to the relationship with each other, has been demonstrated to be, within the terrible limits of our scientific approach to psychological matters, has been shown to be crucial in the outcome of the psychotherapeutic task. As you know, and as I remarked the other time, psychotherapy is effective by the measures that have been brought to test it, but psychotherapy is ineffective in terms of the capacity to distinguish one form of psychotherapy in its effectiveness from another. And this has led people to either condemn these studies or else to say that perhaps there are factors common to the relationship in psychotherapy which are the determining factor of success. These are called, somewhat sneeringly, non-specific factors. But one way of reading or hearing what I have been saying for these last 8 or 9 lectures is that we can make these non-specific factors specific. Of course, they are specific, but we just don't attend enough or don't respect enough what they are, so we dismiss them that way. So, as I say, one way to hear what I'm trying to develop is the idea that the so-called non-specific factors are in fact very specific. Furthermore, they are extremely difficult to apply in specific circumstances, especially with, say, paranoid people, as I said very early on, megalomaniac people, or depressed people, that it is hard to make them felt. And so these exercises here are really attempts to show how you might do it. Now, what are the non-specific factors? There are various descriptions of them. I reviewed recently a book, an enormous book, in which so-called integrated psychotherapy was the subject, and many of these discussions came down to a search for these factors, and so that I read many descriptions, and I'm sure you have read many too. But the 2 figures in the history of psychotherapy who have had the largest impact on defining what we mean by these non-specific common factors, that's another for them, common factors they're often called, are Jerome Frank and Carl Rogers. And you recall that in Frank's very impressive review of psychotherapy in different cultures, in different methods, he made a great deal of 4 factors of ritual and rationale, relationship. What is the 4th? I've forgotten. But they're setting factors as well as content factors, and I think all are very important in the outcome of the work. And they relate to Carl Rogers' work, because Carl Rogers' work was mostly concentrated on the relationship aspects of the experience, although there were certainly things he condemned, good rituals and bad rituals. And in the Carl Rogers literature, which of course continues and has been very extended, 3 factors have been thought to be of great significance. The first was understanding and empathy, and the other was what he's, I think, best called prizing the patient. That had its most famous expression in the terms unconditional positive regard. I think prizing is probably a more useful term for it. But in any case, and you also remember the very interesting thing that happened when, I don't know the history of it, but when he went to Wisconsin to study schizophrenia, I don't know why he had to go to Wisconsin to study from Chicago, but I suppose it was a matter of a professorship or financing. But anyway, when he got there, he found out those were not adequate factors, especially in dealing with schizophrenic patients. And he added a third, genuineness. He found it was particularly important in dealing with schizophrenic patients to be genuine. And I think that really is an indication of Rogers' intuitive genius, because think of what that required, because these are the hardest patients for most of us to be genuine with. But he was able to see, I think very correctly, that if you can do that, you have opened a gateway to some kind of progress. I'm not saying that the condition is obliterated or anything, but you open the way to significant gains in the management, especially the prevention of hospitalization of patients with so-called schizophrenia. Now, if you ask yourself, as I so often have, what genuineness means, I will not venture into that mare's nest. But it has something to do, surely it has something to do with what I've been calling psychological reality. The capacity to be present relatively without disguise, without convention, cliche, or preconception, etc. But now I would add to these common factors two more, which I'm going to discuss here, and they both relate to the problem of power, which I feel that Jerome Frank understands better, I think, than Carl Rogers at least expressed himself as understanding. And in the application of power, which is, as I say, a non-quantifiable kind of thing and more easily sensed than described, except in extreme cases, I'm going to try to persuade you that here there are a group of factors that are important. One is persistence. I think that, particularly in the age of short-term work, persistence is not valued as a critical factor in making ourselves felt, in the impact of ourselves, the power we bring to the situation. And the second is the transmission of courage, about which I'm going to speak also today. Because when it comes to repetition and crossing what I call the shadow line, out of the repetitions into something new, courage is the thing that the patients feel most without. This is a fearful, terrifying experience to do something new. So we want persistence and courage, and I'm going to attempt to approach the question of power in a sort of pseudo-quantitative way by talking about dosage of ourselves under this topic of transmitting courage. Let me just stop there for a moment, and that's really a summary. But before I go on to what I hope is a useful illustration, in case you had any questions or objections or unclarities that would be helpful to clarify. Isn't that a wonderful thing of Nietzsche's? But what it must have been like for him to write something like that. This man who, in so many places, for all his intuitive genius, his psychological grasp sometimes seems, a wild, restless spirit, and was, in fact. And whose experience of love, actually, if you read what little I think is really written that sounds reliable about that, certainly isn't in keeping with, in the published versions anyway, of what he. But of course, it so often is, isn't it? What did Shaw say? Bernard Shaw say? Those who do, those who can't teach, something like that. Well, I'll go forward here now. You've only yourselves to blame. I want to describe someone whom I alluded to briefly before, a woman about 34, 35, who came to me because she felt at an impasse. She had experienced repetitive obstructions in a way that made it possible for her to sort of present a kind of textbook account of the repetition compulsion experience, both in her personal life and in her work life. Her family had broken up when she was young. She had a younger sister and one brother. From a very early age, she gave extensive evidence of being a talented artist, and quite apparently, one always wonders how independent anything is, but it seemed like a kind of self-starting way. She had even had, as a young woman in her about 1920, a show of her own, which had been a local thing, but a success in her mind. Although it was strikingly remembered by the indifference of her family to this effort, even hostility. Her mother had wanted both the daughters to marry, and had been very persistent in arguing for that course, and to marry well. By well meant financially well. And one daughter, not the patient, had followed this advice with striking success, becoming herself a doctor and marrying a very successful doctor, and according to the descriptions of the patient, becoming altogether miserable, even though she had this, classically successful life. And but the patient herself had not followed that advice. Although when she first came to me, she was married, but very discontent, and it had even in the courtship and at the moment of marriage itself, extraordinary hesitations, which she had essentially discounted. I thought I could hear in them the call of conscience, but she did not. She heard the call, really, principally of her mother in this, who was very pleased with her choice of this, relatively wealthy man to be her husband. Now, she had retreated, that's her words, had retreated from her artistic career, becoming a very successful designer. She was much sought after, and I have known only a few designers in my life, but one of the things that struck me as perhaps even extraordinary about this young woman was that she was a successful designer, but on frequent occasions, I can remember 4 or 5 specific ones in the course of say 4 years' work, where people had been astonished by what she had produced. And in one quite famous incident, the author of a book, which was a very complicated computational book, had found in her designs an understanding of his computations, that she had managed to make graphic his computation in a way that taught him something and astonished him. And so there was a gift here that was impressive, but there remained, beside the successful career, a fairly constant call from within herself to do the art that she had abandoned. Now, she had heard that call for a period in the course of her beginnings of her design career by going to art school. And I don't know what your experience of art schools is. Mine is very limited, but the more I've heard of it, the more it's reminded me of psychotherapy school, in that the people come into the work and then they fall under the aegis of some dominant character who then attempts to turn them into versions of him or herself. And art, I don't know which is more sensitive, the artistic or the psychotherapeutic soul, but these powerful personalities can indeed stamp out versions of themselves, but the work that is done by the subordinates, so to speak, proves to be, as you would expect, repetitious, tiresome. I think a great deal of the history of psychoanalysis can be written in these terms. And it was certainly the case with her that she felt actually she had a sexual relationship too, with one of these men who had a very strong position in abstract expressionist art in America, a movement that never particularly attracted her. And this drew her away from her work. He then turned against her. There was a period where she was very depressed. This is before I saw her. And that in that setting she had really given up again her artistic interests. But still, they were, if dormant, they were still tapping at least at the edge of her consciousness. So there she was. And the earliest part of our work was very much about whether she should stay with this man, whether she should not stay with this man, and as we all know, this is one of the most difficult decisions, not only personally for people, but in terms of our advisory capacity. And it's so easy to form judgments about these things which prove to be wrong. I don't know what your experience of watching people's marriages is, but I have found my own prophetic capacity to be nil. I've lived in the same place most of my life, so you get to see an awful lot of couples, and every now and then, of course, one sees these things in the course of what appears to be disintegration, and you may have 3 or 4 disintegrating at the same time, and you think about, now, which is going to work, which isn't, which is going to disintegrate, which isn't, and as I say, my prophecy average on that one is, I hope yours is better than mine. Now, she had, in relationship to her sought-for artistic career, a very distinct experience, which I think I really can fairly reliably attest to, because as a phenomenon, it has recurred so many times. That is, she will, for one reason or another, be excited. She takes a vacation. She likes to go to Greece, and she takes photographs, and she comes back with the photographs, and they excite in her certain notions of what she might do with them. And then she sits down with the photographs. In a very short time, she literally flees from these photographs. She finds herself just moved out of the room. And if one asks her what she might have been thinking, as we are wont to do in this business, right? She says things about how, I'll never make any money, and she'll remember things she's believed, taught, hears all from the culture around her that art is a foolish, useless, crazy business. Right? It certainly isn't a regular moneymaker, and she flees. Now, it soon became apparent that there was one other experience, now in the personal realm, from where she also literally fled, or turned her back. She had grown up with a young woman about her own age, whom she was very fond of, and whose family remained a kind of beckoning to the family she wished she'd had. And in the course of our work, for a variety of reasons, partly seemingly adventitious, she took up her friendship after many years with this young woman again. And it was a joyous kind of reunion, also because she was welcomed back into that family after many years and felt very good. And she met again the brother of her friend, whom she had known as a young man, and whom she had always been interested in. And he impressed her greatly by his genuineness, by his understanding, by his prizing her in certain ways. And so on occasion, her friend, the sister of this man, would urge them to get together, and the family would plot these reunions. And she welcomed that because she loved being in the family. But she found herself in the presence of this young man, the brother, doing what she did with her art. She would quite literally, when he would come toward her, she would turn her back. And she would do it with a sense of fear that she could not remain there, even though she would say to me that he really had remained in her mind, even as a kind of touchstone of what she thought would be wonderful for her to be in contact with. Well, there I was. Now, you can't ask for a clearer prescription of goals, can you, than those two, the art and this man. And again, I hope you don't see me as someone bellowing with confident delight about the rightness of doing this or that. As someone who has a very partial artistic effort of his own, from whom he has made almost no money all his life. I'm talking about writing. And to recommend such a foolhardy course to a self-employed and successful young woman would be some form of madness. So I bided my time, but she did move out of the marriage. She managed to communicate her ambivalence so thoroughly to 3 successive lawyers that they managed to blow the case up into extraordinary proportions and leave it unsettled. But that seems to have been moved a little bit better. Now, I ask your judgment on this because it's as I ask myself in turn, how did I decide that there was a goal that she should pursue beside her saying that she wanted to pursue it but not pursuing it? How did I know? If we follow Nietzsche's advice, why didn't she stay with the husband? And by pursuing the difficulties, becoming familiar with the unfamiliar, what are some of the phrases? Strangeness, indulgence toward what is odd. She could certainly found many of those factors in her first husband, from her description anyway. Why not stay with it until it dawned upon us that we should miss it if it were lacking? and I indeed, would hope that she would make every effort to have the thing work. But she began to answer her own question: where do I want to be? What's for me? By giving a striking account of her sexual life, which had been for her considerable pleasure and was one of the reasons that she married. It's hardly surprising, but her description of her sexual life was like so many, like her perhaps precise graphic art, and perhaps too graphic, perhaps too formed. In any case, was very distinct. And she said that it was possible for her to enjoy sex because it meant nothing to her. It was pleasurable, but it meant nothing to her. That she was not present in it. And that made it possible for her to be very free. And here we see what, actually I think Krafft-Ebing was the first to write about in great detail, the separation of the emotional and the sexual current. When Freud wrote about it in terms of hysteria, of course, at great length also. Here was the sharpest description of the separation of those two currents I ever remember hearing. And when she was with someone with whom she was fond, most notably this brother I talked about, her sexual anxiety was at a peak. In case I forget it, there came a moment in the transformation of this young woman's, transformation is too strong, in the change of this young woman's orientation, that she had a dream, actually about this same man, the brother of her friend, in which she experienced, to her memory at least, the first opening of a sexual interest toward an emotionally charged, positively charged person. But that was some time later. Here it was becoming clear that if something meant something, she could not approach it. If it didn't mean something, she was free to approach it. But that seemed to be the formula. That her design work, which, as I say, was very successful and appreciated, did not mean anything to her. She found it very easy to do. And the same thing was true, as I say, in her personal relationships. Now that's a formula. If it means something, if it doesn't mean something. And those formulas have dogged us in all our work, right? They're so easy to feel one can apply. And the last thing I want is to promulgate any fresh cliches which will pound our patients back into the ground. Now the same repetitive blocking, of course, I say, of course, and underline, occurred in relationship to me. There it took an also, unusually distinct form, although not an unfamiliar one. That is, she wanted very much to come to the treatment because she felt so stuck. On the other hand, she was terrified to come because she was convinced I would find her hollow and impossible. And so that the result of that as we all know so distinctly, the result of that joint conflict, the result of that joint is that the patient does come but doesn't come. that is, they get themselves into the room, at least most of the time, but they're not present. And they are afraid to be in the room, except as a successful designer or as someone who has a marriage that doesn't work. Because to be otherwise in the room is to pretend to be something they don't feel they are. And so quite inevitably and naturally, they then feel fake and empty in the treatment. So they all the more want to get out again. And there she was. And now, you recall the purpose of these remarks is to try to design means by which one overcomes this business. How could I help her to bring herself into the room? How could I help her to believe that I did not regard her as empty and hopeless? And so those are the kinds of tasks, I think, notably, that we have. I started out my listing of the things which seem to be important in this work by mentioning the balance of power. Here I felt quite comfortable, and I think if one does feel a relative balance of power, one is given freedom, because one is less likely to take advantage, because the patient won't let us. And she had a nice way of backing me off. It was brisk. It was not hurtful of me, but it was brisk. One could feel something go up, and she would, I think, disappear still more completely. But there was also a way of sort of wrapping my knuckles, so to speak, in it, that I don't describe well, but that was quite distinct. And that gave me a little feeling of freedom. But I was struggling with another problem, because I had already decided, I think, at least in that part of my unconscious life with which I'm in touch and therefore not unconscious, with which I'm very familiar from long experience, I'd already decided that I had found my mother. Now I'm exaggerating, but in her melancholy state, in her sort of beautiful melancholy, I found a note that my mother had struck in our relationship, almost at my birth, I think, and which has always drawn me. Probably helps me become a psychiatrist, since one has so many sad people one can meet. And which I know is not a very good idea for me to get too interested in. Not because I can help getting interested in it, but because I might keep the patient that way. So that this repetition compulsion, I'm saying, is now operating from both sides, from the treatment side as well as the patient side. The patient is caught between wanting to change but fearing to change because there's no one, he doesn't have the stuff to change, right? And I'm caught between wanting to keep her the way she is because she gives me this feeling that I once had as probably the principal part of my relationship with my mother, that gives that back to me, right? So I would like to keep her that way. On the other hand, that's called malpractice or something worse, right? So there the two of us were, beautifully hoist on our respective, petard? I don't know what a petard is, but we were hoisted anyway. Now, I've been, making a lot of noise up here for quite a long time about the psychologically real, and if you're impatient with it, in a sense, so am I, because I know it would be hard to convince any really hard-nosed scientist type that I knew what I was talking about. But nevertheless, I come back to that point. It seemed to me, and at this juncture particularly, when the two of us are caught up with our respective cliches, you might say, her cliches of nothingness and the propriety of rich, boring lives, and me caught up with my mother, or whatever other cliches I'm involved in, Um, what have we got to get us out of it, other than the idea we shouldn't be in it? And I think here psychological reality is, I mean, it's not all we've got, but my hunch is it's probably the largest thing. And by that I mean this. Could I hear in her something more than this repetition of the note that had been struck between my mother perhaps and me? And of course, could she hear something else? Well, for her it might have seemed easier because, she had heard this tapping, the call, as I chose to, or beckoning, as I mentioned it earlier on, pointing to the brother of her friend, pointing to her art. So it was there. But she was feeling with me an emptiness. Now, could I find in her emptiness a reality to which I could respond to and which I could mobilize, perhaps? That seemed to me crucial. And I think about this a great deal, and because a considerable part of my experience, particularly in this building, is involved in supervision, and because I'm responsible for a residency training program, this matter of one's sensitiveness to psychological reality becomes uppermost over and over. For example, it's my impression that residents, I can't speak for psych interns, but residents come to us in two forms. Everything comes to us in two forms, but here are two more forms. That is, there are residents whose capacity to understand the formal world, the rules and regulations, and pick up the language of their surroundings, that capacity is highly developed in some. And I think it's because of Harvard's prestige and attractiveness to many ambitious people that we get some of the most extraordinary practitioners of what you might call formal learning. On the other hand, there's another group of residents who may even seem incorrigible in that regard, who sort of lounge around. They may not dress right. They certainly don't act right. They don't talk right. And nowadays, the charge which is brought against them with an almost inquisitional authority is that they don't understand boundaries. And if you don't understand boundaries nowadays, boy, watch out. You may think incense is bad. Incense, that's good. Incest is bad, but just try boundaries. And now the boundary problem is a crucial one in the problem of psychological reality, because by definition, if you grasp people's psychological reality, you've already crossed a boundary outside of formality. And the fact that that's, in my opinion, a highly crucial thing to do doesn't mean that you follow your nose for the reel into someone's crotch or something. That's not what I'm recommending at all. In fact, that probably indicates you've lost sight of the reality of the situation in some respects, but that has been argued, certainly. In any case, this capacity to relate to people in a relatively sort of natural way, well, I go back to my Mozartiana quotes, in a relatively natural way, is suspect in young professionals, because they're supposed to be learning about boundaries. And you see it in the medical students, most forcibly, of course, who often come in with a capacity to relate to the patients which far surpasses their seniors, but that they're soon talked out of that. And they may be so much talked out of it that it takes them another 20 years of effort to get back to it. And of course, in our psychological training, that is more the case. Now, my experience, and this may be just a function of my ferocious prejudices, but in my experience, it's much easier for a person with a sort of over-real sense to learn to wear the cloak of the day than it is for the over-formal people to drop the cloak of the day. And so that if you have to pick two between them, you're going to find it easier. We're all mixtures of both, and each of us, nobody gets it right, so blah, blah. So everybody's off a little bit. But I think on the whole, in my experience, with the residents, that the ones who have a higher sense of the real and are less formal are find it easier to learn this work, and are of course greatly revered by more of the patients. But here I was, with my sense of reality being tested by the extent of emptiness the patient had. Now I use the word tested here with malice aforethought, because I was really being tested. As if she continued to feel empty in my presence, it would be easy for me to say, oh, well, she's just empty. But I should entertain very seriously the possibility that I wasn't coming across to her, and that that's the reason she felt empty. And I know no way to separate out those two, to answer the claims of those two hypotheses, but I think we'd be very foolish in this work if we assumed it was the first and not contributed to at least by the second. Especially if the therapist was like me in thinking about my mother. What the hell was she supposed to make of that? Hardly reality. I mean, the old lady's been dead now for about 22 years and wasn't alive for a period before that, actually. So that was one problem. Now there was another problem. Her adaptation, sexual adaptation, vocational adaptation, her adaptation in marriage figured heavily with what you might call a therapeutic orientation. That is, she had grave misgivings about this man she married, but she thought she was going to improve him. This even before they got married. I find that a chilling thought. People tell me that. I tell them I hope they have better luck in that regard than I do with my patients. Well, anyway. But she, and her sense of responsibility, in other words, was a strong part of her life, and it was wonderfully evident in many things, including the way she handled me. I appreciated it. I didn't, for example, worry about the bill. How about that? How would it be nice to have patients one didn't have to worry about the bill? Well, here's somebody so responsible, you could be sure that, if you get nervous toward the end of the month, that you'll find it in the mailbox. And, and one is thankful. So I could be all the time playing into her heightened sense of responsibility. It made her design work, I'm sure, one of the reasons for her success. She got her assignments in on time, and they were completed. There was no laxity there. So, but, it meant in the treatment that she was treating me. Now, that's always the case, and thank heavens for it. But it very often is the principal preoccupation of the patient, who is used to dealing with irresponsible people, and for that reason may be in trouble, and therefore expects that we'll have some of that anyway, and attempts to do the best to get us along on about our job. That's routine stuff. Right? And it isn't just if you have a lot of patients who are therapists themselves. It's true of everybody. Not everybody, but a lot of people we see. Now, in this case, you see, she had that position, this common position that she took, that she was responsible for the treatment to a large measure. And perhaps having figured out that I was dreaming about my mother, she was very sensible to adopt such a posture. Anyway, that put me in an impossible position now, because that meant that indeed the emptiness she felt in herself was not going to be filled in this relationship, because she was going to have to do for me what she'd always done for these, these near loser types that she got involved with. So I had to take responsibility. Now, in a sense, I was being overpowered by her, wasn't I? So I had to reassert my responsibility in this relationship to provide some kind of balance in this. Now, her mother and her father both, although long divorced, both believed that children should be responsible. And she, perhaps more than any of the other two sibs, had taken that lesson to heart. And so she thought, and here was another reason for her condemning herself in the treatment, she thought that she was responsible for making the treatment work. Furthermore, she had educated herself in treatment and read, for example, a lot of our documents, which say that the patient has to do this themselves, and then we stand outside, making clever remarks now and then and waving at them while they're supposed to go about their business. Now, you've heard me, and you've heard me bore you with my statement that Freud's invention, that is the analytic method, was a brilliant way of doing that, and very useful for those patients who should not be helped, who need to get over being helped and go and do it for themselves, the so-called good hysterics, who are just on the cusp of the Oedipal thing and who need to be left alone. So that Freud's genius, quite surreptitious, I don't know, by chance, just chanced upon this method of holding people while you left them alone. And in my experience, which is extensive now, this works for those people who need to be left alone, but will entice people into doing too much for them. But that's a special case, and she was not of that kind. She was really stuck. So I had to take responsibility. How did I do it? I delivered all kinds of messages. She thought that people should do it by themselves, so I said, no one ever does it by themselves. And I love to quote that, and I'm sure I've already told you this at least once, being in my anecdotage. I love that thing that Freud wrote to Arnold Zweig. You remember the one where he says, this is Sigmund, this is the great man himself speaking now, or writing. He said, I find this so extraordinary, I keep saying it over and over. He says, I am a great rock. Sigmund Freud says, I am a great rock against which the waves of history batter and are spent. I mean, I don't know how you feel, but it isn't the way I feel. I sort of would like to, and sometimes when I think of Churchill at the battle over England, and I think of that stalwart figure in the ruins of the House of Commons standing up and shaking his fist at the heavens, I think that, well, there may be a little bit of that in all of us, but not very much. But I then said to her, as I said to myself and to others, that, don't forget, Freud's mother thought he was the golden Siggy. From his early life, he was adored by his mentors. He acted as if he was all alone in the world, but he had Fleece and Jung and a crowd of people, all of whom had rings. You remember the rings? Not the rings of the Nibelungen, but the rings of the Vienna Circle, and not the other Vienna Circle, which bound them all together in a pact of solidarity. So he didn't do it by himself. No one does it by themselves. Everybody who thinks they do it by themselves are forgetting the voices that were built into them years and years ago, which encourage them, which soothe them, which make their lives wonderful. But voices which were missing to some extent from this young woman's head, because the voices she heard, beside the beckoning to art and something better, the other main voices she heard were the voice of her mother saying, artists are ne'er-do-wells. Get yourself a rich husband. Get kids. Because if you have kids, people think you're respectable. Children are the great badge against the alienation feelings of human beings. In fact, it may be one of the principal functions they perform. They're poor little things in their voyages through life. Well, we went on repeating ourselves, right, as I'm doing here. We went on. She accused herself of just fantasizing about her art. That was the phase we entered. I think it's not an unusual phase. She accused herself of fantasizing about art but never doing anything about it, just dreaming about it, or fantasizing about so-and-so without doing anything about it. And I welcomed her fantasies. I urged them on. Because only by our fantasies do we ever do anything, right, I think. So let her love them, let her have them, let them beckon now, along with her conscience, towards something that she might do. she might become. And when she said she couldn't do it, I would say to her things like, well, of course you can't do it. If you could have done it, you would have done it years ago. I'm here now. and you're knowing that, well, God knows, make very little difference. It may even depress you, the thought, if that's all that stands between you and disaster is me. But anyway, I would say that over and over again. And I thought, maybe again it's so easy to fool yourself in this work, but I thought that she got some of that, and sometimes she would look at me as if to say, well, what are you going to do, And I would say, well, I don't know, but I'll think of something, and we'll do it, and then I would say things like, with your possibilities and your talents and everything, how can I miss? And I felt that way too. Now you see where these comments fall in our 3 or 4 different things that I think are called common factors, but unfortunately are uncommon factors applied to difficult circumstances. Oh, it's very easy to prize the patient that's doing great, right? Oh, it's very easy to understand someone whose problems are like your own. Oh, it's very easy to have a respectful relationship with the patient respectful to you. All those 3 famous Rogerian criteria. But we know very well that there are many circumstances when you can't respect this hateful person. You certainly don't understand someone whose perverse desires you've been suppressing yourself. Or finally, you can't prize someone who seems like such a perennial loser. Right? So, but I kept at it, and I did believe in her in all these. In all these respects. And now I thought I was doing my job because I was taking some responsibility. She was throwing all her negations against me, for all her disbelief, all the remarks about how well you learned that in psychotherapy school. That's what they teach all the little students to do. You're just doing it because you learned it, or I'm paying you, so how could you possibly be sincere? All these very sensible arguments that make our efforts essentially theatrical, in the sense that it's just a put-on thing. You pay a certain fee, you go in and you watch Hamlet, then you go home and where's Hamlet, and so that any sensible patient is, looks at the whole thing as a movie that'll be over soon, and it's so repetitive and boring, and as Elvin Semrad used to say, mud driving, spinning your wheels, that one would like to go home. But after a while, a persistence, and here's the persistence, comes along to add to the Rogerian factors. The persistence can pay off. And above all, the patient's evaluation of my being really present for them. Can that survive their skepticism, my fatigues or irritations, the inevitable sort of things of life between us? So in that sense, the treatment was really not just a rehearsal, but in fact the real thing, in the sense that I was being tested. I mean, my passion had to match her stubborn fear. Right? Now in this business, that there's something beyond persistence. Not very far beyond persistence, but beyond persistence, and beyond prizing, and beyond understanding, beyond respect even. And that is what I call giving courage. Now, courage is not something that I have heard very much said. I mean, it's a famous word in the philosophical literature that touches on psychology, and sometimes even psychotherapy, like the famous book title, The Courage to Be. And we know that it's alluded to, but in our formal schemes of psychotherapy, it is very seldom made a central matter. But it seems to me very central. The Greeks, I'm told, regarded courage as the first of virtues. Now I don't know why that is, and if you're scholars, it may be because in war is very important. And if you're not courageous in war, if you turn tail and run like most of us, it's not good for the cause. And nowadays, we can't defend courage on the basis of its usefulness in war, because we've learned that war doesn't work. It's not one of the solutions we've got anymore. Even if we're going to bomb the Serbs, it's not going to work for very long. It may be a good idea, but war is not. Ever since we discovered that ways of releasing projectiles and then not being able to get them back, war has been a very risky business. But courage has taken on an existential meaning, and that is, it has, as embodied in the title of that famous book, The Courage to Be. See, the background of that, very briefly, which again I have mentioned to you, is Heideggerian as well as other people. That is the existential framework, sort of the phylogeny although they call it an ontogeny, existential work was that we are thrown into life, that we then fall, because when we're thrown into life, we accept what's around us, so we fall victim to what is around us. And then there comes the point, at various times in life, sometimes not at all, when we are tested as to whether we can be. Up to that point, we're nothing, we're just them, or thrown creatures. And then, can we be? And the word Heidegger uses, project ourselves. If you read the existential literature, it's one of the things that makes it the technical literature. It makes it so difficult is that, and they may explain why Heidegger was a Nazi. Is that they'll use words like care, and you think they're talking about what we're interested in. And in a sense, perhaps they are, but they really mean by care simply the idea that we all point in some direction. Caring is pointing. We're all pointing. But can we point to something else beside ourselves? Well, we point to them a lot, too. But in this caring, which is really a pointing for them, is only minutely contained the idea that we make a commitment that is ours. You hear it there, but it's faint. But that requires courage. Courage to overcome the nothingness, the non-being, the non-design, sort of all of this stuff. So courage comes back into us, not around the business of war, but perhaps for the same reason. That is, war, the purpose of war, at least as it was originally developed, was to protect yourself, to allow yourselves to be, so they didn't kill you. Right? Well, here it is not so much the matter of warlike protection of being, but projection of ourselves, finding a world of our own, etc. Well, now, I probably could have saved you a lot of time and money if I had said at the beginning that the essence of these perhaps seemingly interminable remarks is contained in a famous German internist's statement that nothing happens until the doctor is touched by the patient. Nothing happens until the doctor is touched by the patient. Remember, I've said that in any number of ways. I said, for example, in the neurophysiological thing, that cell interaction is a function of one making droplets into the interspace between the two. I've spoken about the impact of perspectives on each other. I've spoken about emotional contagion. And the real, too, emerges in our emotional apprehension of the person. And the balance of power is aimed at preventing one set of secretions overpowering too much the other, of being too much touched by the patient. And this business of persistence, which the social worker Howard Lipkin calls the quantitative principle. That's a term I love for persistence, the quantitative principle. You catch that? How subtle that is? What a clever way, because it in the modern scientific religion mind, if you call something the quantitative principle, everyone will be much more interested in it than if you call it persistence. It takes a certain amount of the quantitative persistence to get from A to B, right? Even though what you're saying is pretty familiar. So in the quantitative principle, too, we want to be touched. We want to be moved so we can move the person. So how do we move a person to courage? Now here too, we must be as scientific as we can. See, because if my heart is failing, let us say that my beat heart is failing, right? I want the doctor to come, and I don't want the doctor to hold my hand and wish my heart well. I don't want him to pray for the sustenance of my cardiovascular system. Hell no, I want him to do something specific. I want him to get it beating right. I spent some of the most anxious moments of my young life in the cardiac services trying to adjust the quinidine so that the patient's heartbeat didn't sound like a Chicago gang war, you know. And it was awfully anxiety-provoking, but that's what I want when my time comes. I want something very specific. And that doctor, if he's going to work, has to work through the medium of exchange of my body. He has to know the right dosage of the medicine, right? And he has to make sure he transmits the right medicine. So let's use those three principles now for the transmission of courage. The medium of exchange. What is the medium of exchange? What is the right dosage? And what is it that we're transmitting when we're transmitting courage? Well, the medium of exchange, what is that? The transmission of courage. What makes for a medium which can exchange? That's what we want now. Something which can exchange what I have to give and the patient may have to give back or correct. What does that? It has to be a medium in which there is what? Understanding? That certainly would be almost another word for it, wouldn't it? And if the medium of exchange is going to be receptive of what I put into the bloodstream, so to speak, the bloodstream has to prize it, has to value it, doesn't degrade it, lets it go through the system, right? That too must be present. And what else is needed in the psychological medium of exchange to make sure that whatever I bring to the person is effective? That's it. You see, so my wonderful heart doctor shows up with his bag full of medicines. Well, he can't unscrew the top. He can't. Do you ever have that experience when you're in pain and they couldn't get the drug out of the bottle, or the doctor was trembling so much he couldn't put the needle on the syringe? Have you ever had that experience? It's disquieting. Well, I want my doctor to go right in there, take it out, stick it in me, and do what's necessary. Same way here. How would you know a psychological medium was conducive? Well, here I think the Rogerian criteria are right. The prizing, the understanding, and the genuineness, the respect. And by genuineness, the fact that the person is really there for me, not there because, they were forced to or whatever. They were there for me. I think those constitute the adequate psychological medium of exchange for the inducing of courage or inducing of anything. I mentioned last time, this neurotic phantom. You remember the lawyer who had this strange thing when I first met him, and I knew it wasn't his. It didn't belong on his body, And I found this teacher of his who had the same gesture, but for him it was his own, and I tested to see if there was the medium of exchange by finding out what the old man thought about the young man, and when I mentioned the young man, he lit right up, so the medium of exchange was still there. It was a channel still working, you might say, still identifiable. That's what we want.